Israel's story goes like this. Moses rescues them from Egypt. He leads them through the wilderness right up to the promised land, but dies right before they go in. Joshua becomes the new Moses and leads the people, conquering land one war at a time. This is how the book of Joshua ends. It has a nice, beautiful bow tied to it. Listen to Joshua 21, 43 through 45. Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to their ancestors that he would give them. And having taken possession of it, they settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their ancestors. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. Not one of all of the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. Everything at the end of Joshua is nicely ordered. It literally ends with, all came to pass. What a beautiful bow. But it doesn't last. What comes next is the book of Judges, and it's one of the greatest disorderings in all of the Bible. The plan is for Joshua to cross into the promised land, which he does, but he meets adversary after adversary while spreading from region to region. Now you'll remember Israel eventually groups themselves into 12 tribes and splits the land across 11 regions. But it doesn't go as smoothly as you'd think. Listen to Judges 1 describe what's happening as Israel spreads throughout the region. Judges 1:27. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor, or its villages, or the inhabitants of Beliam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. But the Canaanites continued to live in the land. Judges 1:29. Ephraim fought but did not drive out the Canaanites. Judges 1:30. Zebulun fought but did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Nahalol. Judges 1:31. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko, or the inhabitants of Sidon, or of Mahalab, or of Agzib, or of Melba, or of Aphik, or of Rehob. What this tells me is that Israel may have taken charge of the promised land, but they still lived amongst their enemies. Think about that. This notion that they'd be the only ones to live in the promised land, it died to the reality that they were going to have to do life with their neighbors, which they were called to be a light to. They were always meant to live among their neighbors. They just didn't realize that. And this disordered Israel to no end, because they really don't ever live as a light to their neighbors. What really happens is they move in, they get settled amongst their neighbors, they become enemies, and then that dissolves further into disorder and war. Look at Judges 1:28. When Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not in fact drive them out. Israel didn't become a light to the nations. They became Egypt to the Canaanites. They escaped slavery only to become the enslaver. Order, disorder. Which you really need to think on this. Order is never strong enough on its own to sustain Israel. And that's true for us too. There's always a way things should have gone. But that's not how life works out. Disorder is inevitable. Things are going to break and loosen and fall short. And then you have to adjust. Transformation happens when you're able to see this reality for what it is. So here's a paradoxical truth I want you to see. You should not fear disorder. In fact, your faith needs it, but it can capsize you if you're not conscious to its arrival. Israel was capsized by its endless wars. Hundreds of thousands of people died because of all of this disordering. And this paradox really sets in for us when we realize that it is very, very, very hard to become conscious to your disordering while you're experiencing it. It takes real spiritual depth to see it In fact, you need a community of faith committed to seeing and listening for God's wisdom and love in the midst of it. This level of spirituality is supposed to be communal and contemplative. And Israel was woefully unprepared to see or even engage their disorder. A tree fell on my grandmother's house 6 weeks ago, destroyed it. Insurance is involved now. It will probably get demolished. She's been living with my parents for the summer, but this week she actually moves into her own independent living facility. You talk about being disordered. I went home last week and got to see the house. It's devastating. The house she lived in her whole life, gone. To really add insult to injury, the new bedroom at her new facility, it's too small for her dresser and her bed to fit. She doesn't want her dresser to be in the living room, so she's going to have to get a new, smaller bed. Disordering is painful, but if you learn to see it as an inevitability, it can serve a purpose when you go through it. And there's a trick you need to know here. To overcome disorder, you have to include it into your narrative. You have to include order to transcend it. You have to enter into the pain if you want to get beyond it. You have to accept the damage being done to transform it. Being conscious and including your pain allows you to give it meaning and for God to show you a path out of it that can transform it. No pain can be healed if it's covered up. You include in order to transcend. And I think Judges shows us the damages of not knowing this, not including your pain. But we have to get up on the balcony in order to really see this book. I want to show you something pretty quickly, and I don't know, maybe you've noticed this, maybe you haven't. But once you see it, I promise, you can't unsee it. So the whole book of Judges follows the arc of 12 judges. And then there's a few shady characters like Gideon's son, Abimelech, and then this unnamed Levite who's awful. When you're up on the balcony, you see that the first few stories of the judges are good. But after Gideon, it takes a nosedive into disorder. Think of Judges as a bell curve. That's the arc of the judges. It begins with such a good order of things, but it ends in a disastrous state of affairs. Now, we can't go through all 12 of these judges this morning, but you can on your own time. And if you do, you'll see it. It's eye-opening. But I do want to just mention a few. Othniel is the first judge. Listen to how Scripture tells his story. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, forgetting the Lord their God and worshiping the Baals and the Asherahs. But when the Israelites cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer from the Israelites. Who delivered them? Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and the Lord gave King Cushan Rishathaim, of Aram into his hand. And his hand prevailed over Cushan Rishathaim. So the land had rest for 40 years. Then Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. So for 8 years they were held captive by their enemy. But then God steps in, raises up a judge, Othniel, and secures 40 years of peace. Order, disorder, reorder. Then comes Ehud and Shamgar. They were also both really good judges. Then comes Deborah, who is probably the best of them all. Her story is worth reading, honestly, every single word. Judges 4 and 5. She's amazing. The Israelites would come to her, and she would sit under a shade tree. Scripture even calls her a prophet. But she's also a military leader. Scripture says that Israel's major military leaders would refuse to take their troops into battle without Deborah being with them because she was a warrior and she was a scholar. But then comes chapter 6. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord again. So Gideon, arose as the new judge. He was a great judge at first, but by the end of his life, he too falls prey to the evils of wanting to become king. He creates idols to worship other than God. And Gideon really breaks the run of all of the good judges, and it just gets worse from there. Gideon's son, Abimelech, should have been the next judge, but instead of being a judge, he names himself king and then kills all of his family members, like 70 of them, so no one can take the throne from him. And he does evil of all kinds in God's sight. His death is a really crazy story, and as you read all of this, you keep hitting a refrain throughout the book, and it says again, Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. This is how the book transitions from one chapter to the next and tells the story. This language is code, reminding us that Israel keeps falling into disorder. They manage peace, but then they do evil in the sight of the Lord. Why? They're human, and because it's inevitable, but also because they failed to include their past in order to transcend it. For instance, Jephthah is another horrendous story. He's Judges chapter 11. Whatever word is worse than horrendous, that's still not strong enough to describe the story of Judges 11. It's diabolical. But then comes more. Ebson, Elon, Abdon, and then it ends with Samson. History records each of them as bad judges. Now you may think you want Samson to be a good judge story because his story's so memorable, but really he's not. He's a bad military leader, a bad judicial ruler. He puts his own desires ahead of the people that he's entrusted to serve. So, the early judges, they're good. And then the pattern is that when they die, Israel falls deeper into sin or does something evil in the sight of the Lord. Yet God raises up a good leader to lead. But they repeat the past, make things even worse, because they failed to learn to transform their pain. Israel's unconscious to the spiritual, and the whole community suffers for it. And when you're on the balcony long enough, you realize that the last few stories in Judges, God is barely even present within the narrative. And I think about this a lot, and I think it's still true today. That's how the book of Judges comes to an end. It's a wrecking ball in the pages of Scripture, and the characters barely even utilize God. Everything's in chaos. Israel is fully disordered, and they're blind to all of it. So, you may be thinking, all of this, yeah, it's somewhat quite interesting, and if I haven't read it, maybe I will go back and read it, but what does all of this have to do with us today? Israel's story is a somber one. Cautionary tale of what happens when we fail to include our pain. God-fearing and even God-loving communities can fall apart when they fail to develop their pain, and they realize disorder disorients. But if you can learn to name it, include it, be present to it, allow God to be in that space with you, you can become reordered. You can become transformed. The Israelites were led to the land of milk and honey by God, but life was more complicated than they realized. Imagine that. Life is more complicated than the original design that we have in our minds. Israel also just misunderstood the assignment. This may be even true for you, and that may be what's causing you to feel disordered. I hope, though, when you're in your disordering, and if you're not, it's coming. You can't stop it, you can't control it. But when you're there, I hope you can see that this space is what it is. Learn to include it. Don't disown or push the pain of it aside. Don't whitewash the significance of it. Include it. Bring God before it, and then let God do the work to transform you. Disorder is disorienting. But if we learn to pay attention to it, it leads us to deeper, and more profound levels of spirituality and truth. You just have to become conscious to it. Otherwise, it will overtake you. And when this happens, there is a way out. And the secret is you have to include in order to transcend. Think on that.